The heat in that house always felt like a damp wool blanket draped over the furniture, heavy and suffocating, the kind of heat that doesn't just sit on your skin but seems to seep into your pores and settle in your joints. It was mid-August in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a time when the world outside should have been vibrant, but inside those walls, everything felt stalled, suspended. The air inside my father's bedroom was a thick, stagnant soup. It smelled of things that were failing. The medicinal, sharp bite of menthol rub, the cloying sweetness of stale peach tea left on the nightstand, and that unmistakable, sour, sharp scent of skin that hadn't seen the sun or a proper breeze in over a year. It was the smell of a body retreating into itself. The air conditioner was a relic, an old window unit shoved into a frame in the hallway. It groaned like a dying animal, a mechanical wheeze that vibrated through the floorboards. But the cool air it managed to wheeze out never quite reached the back of the house. It died somewhere near the linen closet. In that bedroom, the thermometer stayed at a constant, grueling 84 degrees. It was a wet heat, the kind that makes your shirt stick to your spine the moment you sit down. I sat in the wicker chair by the window. It was an uncomfortable thing, the kind of furniture meant for a porch, not a sick room. The weave was tight and dug into my thighs through my trousers, but I didn't move. My thumb was busy. It was rhythmically rotating my wedding ring, around and around. The gold was smooth, worn down by years of this exact motion. It was a habit I'd picked up when my wife, Martha, got sick. Back then, it was a way to ground myself when the doctor spoke in words I didn't want to understand. After she was gone, the habit stayed. It became a tactile prayer, a way to occupy the silence that she left behind. I sat there, the wicker creaking every time I shifted my weight, and I watched Brenda. She was standing by the mahogany dresser, her back turned to me. Brenda had always been the one with the spine of iron. Even as children, she was the one who could skin a knee and just look at the blood like it was an interesting curiosity. Now, she was organized in a way I never managed to be, a way that felt almost clinical. On the dresser sat a brass pill organizer. It was new, 3 tiers high, polished to a mirror shine that caught the dull light filtering through the curtains. Each little door was engraved with the day of the week in a delicate, elegant script. It didn't belong in that room. It looked like something you'd find on a vanity in a black and white movie, a place for pearls or rouge, not a medical tool for a man who could no longer remember his own middle name. Brenda's hand was steady. That was the thing about her. No tremors, no hesitation. She dropped the capsules, white for the pain, orange for the heart, into the Tuesday slot. The sound was rhythmic. Click, click, click. Plastic hitting brass. A series of tiny metallic punctuations in the heavy silence. He's sleeping longer now, Brenda said. She didn't turn around to look at me. She didn't have to. Her voice was flat, a low-frequency hum that seemed to match the vibration of the refrigerator in the kitchen. There was no grief in it, just a statement of fact, like she was reporting the weather or the price of milk. "It's the heat," I said. My own voice felt dusty. "It wears him out. It wears everyone out." I didn't move from the chair. I realized, with a sudden sharp pang of guilt, that I hadn't moved closer to the bed in 40 minutes. I was anchored to that wicker seat by a fear I couldn't name. From where I sat, my father wasn't the man I remembered. He was a collection of sharp angles under a thin cotton sheet, his hip bone jutting here, a shoulder blade there. His breathing was a ragged, wet whistle. It would catch in the back of his throat, a terrifying pause where the world seemed to stop, before his lungs decided to labor through one more cycle. I couldn't look at his face, so I focused on the dust motes. They were dancing in a single, lonely shaft of light that cut through the heavy velvet curtains. They looked like tiny spirits, rising and falling in the stagnant air. "The lawyer called about the estate taxes again," she said, her fingers still dancing over the brass organizer. I rotated the ring. Once, twice. The skin underneath was starting to feel tender. "You handle it, Brenda. You're the one here every day. You know the books better than I do." She finally turned. She didn't look tired. That was the most unsettling part. I expected to see the red-rimmed exhaustion of a caregiver, the hollow eyes of someone who hadn't slept in a week. Instead, her eyes were perfectly clear. She looked at me with a steady, unblinking gaze. She reached out and wiped a tiny smudge off the brass pill organizer with her thumb, polishing it until it shone again. "I'm handling everything, Frank." The lake house was 4 miles down the ridge. It was the opposite of this room. It was a cedar-planked sanctuary that smelled of deep water silt and sun-scorched pine. Growing up, that house was our entire world. The sound of the water lapping against the dock, a gentle, rhythmic slap, 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 was the only lullaby we ever needed. Even in the dead of July, the air on the water was 62 degrees in the early morning. It was crisp. It was clean. That house was the anchor for our family. It was the only thing our father ever truly owned, a prize paid for with 40 years of brutal shift work at the mill, and a back that eventually gave out under the weight of it all. He loved that wood. He loved the way the cedar turned silver in the moonlight. I stayed in Atlanta that summer. I told myself the 3-hour drive was the problem, that the commute was too much to manage on top of everything else. I told myself my consulting firm needed me, that the deadlines were real, even though I knew the juniors were doing most of the heavy lifting. I spent my days in a glass-walled office with the thermostat set to a perfect 70 degrees, sipping cold water and looking at spreadsheets. But the truth stayed in the back of my throat, a bitter pill I couldn't swallow. The truth was that I didn't want to see the meat of him failing. I didn't want to see the way his skin had become like parchment paper. I wanted to remember the man who could haul a stringer of trout up a steep embankment without breaking a sweat, the man whose hands were calloused and strong. I was choosing a memory over a father. I called Brenda every Tuesday and Friday. It was a ritual. I'd sit in my leather office chair, the city of Atlanta sprawling out below me, and I'd dial the number. "How is he?" I'd ask. "He's working his crosswords," she'd say. The sound of her voice over the phone was always punctuated by a specific sound, the sharp, rhythmic rustle of newspaper. Crinkle, snap. "Does he know you? Does he talk?" "He knows when it's time for his medicine," she'd reply. I'd hang up, and the silence of my air-conditioned house would press against my ears like a physical weight. I'd sit there and rotate my ring until the skin underneath was raw and red. I convinced myself that my absence was a form of respect. I told myself I was giving him his dignity by not witnessing the indignity of his decline. If I wasn't there to see him struggle to hold a spoon, then it wasn't really happening. Brenda was the sate. That's how I framed it in my head. She was the one who could handle the bedpans, the confusion, the late-night wandering. She was the one who deserved the medals I'd never have the courage to earn. I was the benefactor, the one who sent the checks, the one who stayed away, so as not to crowd the space. It was a lie, and I knew it was a lie, but it was a comfortable one. In September, the heat finally began to crack, just a little. I drove up for the weekend. The mountains were turning a bruised, deep purple under the shifting clouds, and the air was finally starting to get that autumn crispness at the edges. But when I walked into the house, the smell of pine sol was so thick, it made my eyes water. It was an aggressive smell, a layer of artificial lemon trying to drown out the scent of the end. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table. It was a shock to see him out of the bed. He was wearing a heavy wool cardigan despite the lingering warmth of the afternoon. He looked like a charcoal sketch of himself, the lines of his face drawn too deep. The color bled out of his cheeks. His eyes were milky, unfocused. Brenda sat across from him. Between them lay a stack of Sunday crosswords, yellowing at the edges. She wasn't looking at the clues. She wasn't reading about four-letter word for an Egyptian deity. She was pointing at a line near the bottom of a page, her fingers steady on the newsprint. Right here, Daddy. The 5-letter word for a gift of property. Dad's hand was a skeletal thin. He held a heavy fountain pen, a beautiful old Mont Blanc he used to keep in his breast pocket at the mill like a badge of office. His fingers were white with the effort of gripping it. "I don't know that one, Bren," he whispered. His voice was like dry leaves skittering across a driveway. "Yes, you do. It starts with a G. Just sign it so we can move to the next one. We want to finish the puzzle, don't we?" I stood in the doorway, my hand frozen on the frame. The refrigerator whined, a high-pitched, lonely sound. "Brenda?" She didn't jump. She didn't even look up immediately. She waited. She watched him, her eyes tracking the slow, agonizing motion of the pen. The scratch of the nib on the newsprint was the only sound in the room, a dry, rhythmic tearing sound. "He's tired, Frank," she said, finally looking up at me. Her expression was unreadable. "He's just finishing his puzzles. It's the only thing that keeps his mind sharp." I walked over to the table, my boots loud on the linoleum. The brass pill organizer was there, sitting next to a half-empty glass of lukewarm water. It wasn't shiny anymore. It was covered in dull, greasy fingerprints and a fine white dust, residue from a tablet she must have crushed to make it easier for him to swallow. The Tuesday door was hanging open on a bent hinge, swinging slightly in the draft from the hallway. "Let him rest, Brenda. Look at him. He can barely hold the pen." My voice sounded thin and hollow in the high-ceilinged kitchen. I felt like an intruder in a house I had grown up in. "He wants to finish," she replied. Her voice was like flint. She pulled the newspaper toward her, folding it with a crisp, final snap that sounded like a bone breaking. She stood up, her movements fluid and efficient, and tucked the papers into a plastic accordion folder she kept on the counter next to the toaster. "I'll take him to his room. He's had enough excitement for one day." I watched her lead him down the hall. He didn't walk so much as shuffle, a halting, rhythmic motion of a man who no longer trusted the floor to be there, who expected the ground to give way at any second. I looked down at the table where they had been sitting. There was a faint, deep indentation on the wood, where the pen had pressed through the paper. He had been pushing so hard. I didn't check the folder. I didn't ask to see the crosswords. I was too tired, or too scared, or maybe just too relieved that I didn't have to be the one to lead him down the hall. I went to the lake house that night. I needed the smell of the water. I sat on the dock and watched the moon reflect off the black, silent surface. The temperature had dropped to 55. I shivered, but it felt good. It felt like being alive. I thought about the deed to this place, sitting in the safe deposit box in town. I thought about the future and how lucky I was to have a sister like Brenda. A sister who stayed. A sister who did the hard thing. The funeral was a quiet, gray affair. It was held in a small church at the base of the ridge, a place that smelled of crushed lilies and damp hymnals. The rain was relentless, hitting the tin roof with a steady, metallic drumming that made the minister's words sound like they were coming from underwater. Brenda sat at the end of the pew. Her hands were folded perfectly in her lap. She didn't cry. She didn't even sniffle. She looked like someone who had just finished a very long, very difficult project and was finally allowed to sit down. She looked satisfied. 2 days later, the rain had stopped, leaving the world smelling of wet earth and rot. We met at the house to start the sorting. It was a Tuesday. The house felt cavernous without the sound of the window unit. It was cold now. The silence of physical weight that pressed against my chest. I looked for the deed to the cabin, I said. I was in the study, my father's sanctuary. I was pulling drawers open, looking through old tax returns and faded photographs. The sound of wood sliding on wood was too loud in the empty house. It's not in the desk, Brenda. I checked the small firebox too, the one he kept the birth certificates in. She was in the kitchen. I could hear her packing boxes, the clink of silverware being wrapped in newsprint. It's taken care of, Frank. I stopped. My thumb instinctively went to my wedding ring, beginning that old, familiar rotation. But I forced my hand to stay still. I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles turned white. What do you mean, taken care of? I walked into the kitchen. The smell of old peaches and menthol was gone, replaced by the dry, dusty scent of cardboard and packing tape. Brenda was standing by the trash can. She held the brass pill organizer in her hand. It was dented now, the brass tarnished to a sickly dark brown. As I watched, the hinge on the Tuesday door finally gave way. The small piece of metal fell to the linoleum floor with a sharp clink, a sound like a spent shell casing hitting the ground. She tossed the organizer into the trash. It landed with a hollow thud. The cabin isn't part of the estate, she said. She didn't look up from the box she was taping. The sound of a distant chainsaw echoed from somewhere up the ridge. It was a jagged, biting sound that seemed to shred the silence. Of course it is, I said, my heart starting to thud against my ribs. Dad always said it would be split, 50-50. That was always the plan, Brenda. You know that. He changed his mind, Frank. She reached into her sweater pocket. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a crossword. It was a quitclaim deed. I recognized the legal header immediately. It was dated 3 weeks before he died. And there, at the bottom, was the signature. It was a jagged, shaky scrawl. It didn't look like his old, proud hand. It looked like a bird's footprint in the mud. A desperate scratching of ink on a page. He signed it during the puzzles. My voice was a whisper. The kitchen felt like it was tilting. He signed what I put in front of him, she said. She finally looked at me, and for the first time, there was something in her eyes. It wasn't anger. It was a cold, hard clarity. I was the one who cleaned him, Frank. I was the one who listened to him scream in the middle of the night when the morphine wore off and the pain got behind his eyes. I was the one who sat in this 84-degree heat while you were sitting in your leather chair in Atlanta, looking at the skyline. She didn't raise her voice. That was the part that broke me. She sounded like she was reading a grocery list or explaining a simple math problem to a slow child. He didn't know what he was doing, I said, stepping toward her. He was confused. You know he was confused. He knew he was alone with me, she replied. She walked past me then. Her shoulder brushed mine, and she felt like a statue, cold and unyielding. The house, which had been so hot for so long, now felt freezing. I looked at the thermometer on the wall. It read 64 degrees. I was shivering so hard my teeth rattled. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I just walked out. I got into my car and I drove to the lake house. I needed to be there. I had my own key, a heavy brass thing I'd carried on my keychain for 20 years. But when I reached the porch and slid the key into the lock, it wouldn't turn. I tried forcing it, jiggling it, leaning my weight against the door. Nothing. I looked closer. The brass of the deadbolt was bright and new. It sparkled in the afternoon sun. The cedar planks of the porch smelled of fresh stain, that sharp, chemical scent of a house being reclaimed. I stood there for a long time, my hand still on the useless key. I listened to the water. It was still lapping against the dock. Slap. 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 I thought about those 6 months. The months I hadn't come home because I couldn't leave the office. The months I spent in the air conditioning while my father's lungs whistled in the heat. I thought about the Tuesday phone calls. How is he? He's working his crosswords. I realized then, standing on that porch, that I hadn't stayed away to protect his dignity. I hadn't stayed away out of some noble desire to remember him at his best. I had stayed away because I was a coward, a pure, simple coward. I didn't want the smell of his sickness on my expensive clothes. I didn't want the sound of his ragged breathing to keep me awake at night in my quiet house. Brenda hadn't stolen the house. She hadn't tricked him. Not really. I had handed it to her, piece by piece, every time I chose not to drive up that ridge. I had paid her in silence to do the work I was too weak to do. That deed wasn't a betrayal. It was a bill. It was the invoice for 6 months of my cowardice, and she was finally collecting. I sat on the top steps of the porch. The sun was setting behind the ridge, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard. The shadows looked like fingers reaching for the water. I looked down at my hand. My thumb was moving, tracing the circle where my wedding ring should be. But the ring was gone. I must have taken it off to wash my hands in the old house, or maybe it had slipped off while I was looking through the desk. I pictured it sitting on the kitchen table, right next to that dented, tarnished pill organizer in the trash can. A piece of gold among the refuse. I didn't go back to look for it. I couldn't. The mountain air was turning cold, the kind of cold that promises a hard winter. I got in my car, adjusted the rearview mirror so I didn't have to see the lake, and drove toward the highway. I drove back to Atlanta, back to the air conditioning, back to the silence I had earned.